Okay, here we go. We're live. Anybody online, if you have any questions, any comments, you can add them to the stream and we will address them as we go through it. So, we've already got 2 people. Identify yourselves for the record. We have people every week that never say who they are. I'll find you.
Well, that's not
who
creepy.
you are. How's your mom?
She's good. She had to work a little later today because she didn't get clocked back in.
She was ducking Stephanie's.
We came upon a very serious wreck on 30. Like an 18-passenger van, a truck with a horse trailer.
There was like 5
an 18-wheeler. Like, it was bad.
Today?
Mm-hmm. And Peyton, the evil thing that she is, she's like, wow, did y'all see that steering wheel in the middle of the road?
Oh
And Lexi's like, are they dead? I'm like, oh my gosh, the difference is like.
So she's going to grow up to, Payne's going to grow up to be Harley.
I told her, I said, you're a psycho.
That's Harley. Yep. Harley will murder someone at some point. And they'll be like, there's like a murder and they interview like the family member. They're like, I just couldn't see it. I had no idea. It's just not like them. And they're like, if they interview me, I'll be like, I predicted it. I could have won money on this bet.
Let's hope they don't end up in prison together.
Yeah, for real.
Oh my god.
They'd run it.
Yeah.
They'd rule the prison. All right. So we are this week. Thank you for letting me have last week off. I went and spent the night at Criswell with Jared. We went to class Monday night. Then we had a bunch of classes Tuesday. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. There's Tanya. Hey, Tanya, who's pet sitting for the Phillips. Okay. There you go. We got Howard and Tanya on, and somebody else. So we're going to do Augustine and the Problem of Evil tonight, and then we'll set up Augustine on predestination, which is actually pretty fun because Jimmy had a sermon on it, which I think he did pretty well on it. He had some help from me, but that doesn't matter. It's not important right now. So Augustine and the Problem of Evil. There's 2 different readings. One of them is they're kind of backwards in terms of order of when they were written. So there's one from the City of God, which you might have seen. I brought it in before. It's this big old tome. Other than Confessions, it's probably his most famous work. And then there's one from the Confessions. And then I've got our kind of summary on the back. And like before, hopefully this was a little easier to read.
Yes.
I'm basically translating a translation into modern or more easy to read. So you could be like, well, I don't like that, but Augustine wrote in it in Latin, so no one's actually reading. None of us, at least, are reading Augustine in his original language. All right. So City of God. Any first before we get into it? Any kind of anything that stuck out, or that some of you might not have read it for a couple weeks, but anything that you want to get into before we look at it? No. Okay. Let's look at City of God, Book 12, Chapter 7. That we ought not to expect to find any efficient cause of the evil will. They had wonderful titles for their chapters. No one should look for a cause that actively produces an evil will, because an evil will isn't something created by action, but rather than by a lack or deficiency. So this is a line that summarizes Augustine's rather famous idea that evil is the privation or the deficiency or lack, or pick an easier word to understand, the absence of good. And so when he says, what does he mean by that line? No one should look for a cause that actively produces an evil will, but because an evil will isn't something created by action, but rather by lack or deficiency. What does Augustine mean by cause there? Because he doesn't mean the same thing that we usually mean. Whenever you hear cause anytime around Greek philosophy, you should immediately think of Plato or Aristotle even. What does cause mean here?
Something initiates it.
Yes. And you might have heard of the unmoved mover, or the uncaused cause. This idea that from Plato and then Aristotle that everything has a cause, right? But if you go far back enough, you would have an infinity of causes, right? Because something must produce something. And so Plato rationalized about an uncaused cause, or an unmoved mover, is how we've talked about it. You're looking at dominoes, like a domino that nobody pushed, right? And obviously it's not a real huge leap from the unmoved mover or the uncaused cause to God. I mean, that's what we believe, that everything comes from God. God doesn't come from anything. So he says, don't look for a cause, a being, something that actively produces, creates an evil will. Okay? That created the evil will that had Adam and Eve sin, for instance. Because an evil will isn't something created by action, but rather by lack or deficiency. The will doesn't produce anything. So not only is the evil will the lack or deficiency or privation of something, it's not a real thing, but it doesn't produce anything else. It simply turns away from what truly exists towards what is less real. So for Augustine, the more real you get, the closer you get to God. Like God is the most real. The more you turn from him, the less real you get. The further away you get. This turning away, you could call it sin, this rebellion, is what creates an evil will. Trying to find a cause for this kind of deficiency is like trying to see darkness or hear silence. So here he likens evil to what? What is evil like?
Just the lack of God.
Evil is like darkness. He uses these metaphors.
Yeah.
Evil is like silence. The darkness is just the absence of light. Silence is just the absence of sound. Augustine will say evil is just the absence of good, or evil is the absence of obeying God. And then he says, we can only understand darkness by not seeing light. So you don't go, hey, go find the darkness somewhere. It's just, there's no light. And we understand silence by not hearing sound, right? Silence isn't a thing. It's just lack of sound. So don't ask me to explain something that I admit I don't understand. Okay? You can't understand evil because it's not a thing. All we can know is that it cannot be known. And that's all we need to know. It's a very Bilbo Baggins phrase. All we can know about evil is that it cannot be known. That's all we need to know, for it's not an actual thing. When our eyes stop seeing, we recognize darkness. When our ears stop hearing, we recognize silence. Similarly, our minds recognize forms when we understand them, but we recognize deficiencies by not understanding them or not perceiving them. After all, who can truly grasp what it means for something to be lacking? So Augustine he could have added onto that. When our eyes stop seeing, we recognize darkness. When our ears stop hearing, we recognize silence. When we stop obeying God, we recognize sin. So this is Augustine's idea of evil, or that it's the lack of good. It solves some problems. It creates some other problems. Welcome to life. After all, who can truly grasp what it means for something to be lacking? So he, in the Confessions, which is, I don't think we talk about it here, but he'll talk about, he'll say, cause people say like, well, you can know something and then you can forget it, and that something it was still real, all right? And he'll be like, well, you never really forget. You don't forget something the same way you like close your eyes, because he'll say, let's say you're trying to remember somebody's name, right? I'm like, I know it starts with a J, okay? I can't remember what his name is. Well, if you can't remember somebody's name, and you're trying to find it, like, it's there somewhere, right? Because if you really didn't know, then there would be nothing to try and find. So if you remembered a place, if you've gone to Egypt and you've seen the pyramids, and then years later you're trying to recall what the pyramids looked like and you can't remember it, they're not there anymore. It's there somewhere, or you wouldn't know that you've forgotten something. So Augustine will talk about this.
Inability to recall is not the same as not ever knowing.
Exactly. So it's not really a good analogy. That's how he answers when people try to brought that up. So that's a little excerpt from the City of God talking about evil. Evil is the privation or the lacking of good. Any thoughts there in that paragraph? What do we think? Do we like it? Both of those.
I don't know if I like it.
Okay, Stephanie doesn't know if she likes it, but it's okay. Stephanie's Catholic, so.
Again, yes.
Well,
What's that got to do with anything?
Well, this time of year, Halloween, you think of Halloween costumes and Satan.
Sure.
And Satan would be the cause of evil or whatever
Well,
from a lot of people's perspective.
yeah. Is Satan the cause of evil?
No.
Why isn't Satan the cause of evil?
It's just the face of evil.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like an item.
Yeah, like the poster boy for evil.
So one of the reasons we don't like this is because evil feels real. Evil feels like it's more than just the absence of something. So that's one of the reasons that we don't like evil is the privation of good. Why else might you like this or not like it?
Well, I don't like this because the way that it's sounding, it almost sounds like the moment that you turn away and you make one sin, you become evil. Like,
Yeah, I don't think he's saying that, but he's saying that you can't. And I mean that was my phrase. He didn't actually say that, but he's saying that you can't go somewhere and find these things. You can't go find darkness, go listen to sound, go find evil. Like evil's not real. In the same sense of darkness, that doesn't mean we can't experience it. It's not real in the sense that it's not real because it doesn't exist independently. Okay? So if there was no good, there would be no evil. Okay? You can have good without evil. It's heaven. Right? You can't have evil without good. You wouldn't even know what it is. You can have light without darkness, but you can't have darkness without light being a thing. I guess is what I'm saying. You could, but it wouldn't mean anything. Like if there was never any light and we just moved around in darkness, it would be nonsensical to say this is darkness. It would just be what it was. Sound. What'd you say?
Void.
Yeah, void. I mean, we only can experience these things because of the real thing. Because of light, because of sound, because of good. That's how we know that, when there's no light, we call that darkness. When there's no sound, we call that silence. When it isn't good, we call it evil. We call it sin. So what does this solve? It feels wrong because we have Satan, we have evil feels like a force. Augustine earlier, remember he's a Manichaean when he's younger, so they believe that good and evil were two opposing equal forces. So he's repudiating his Manichaeanism. What this solves is something that hardcore Calvinists have a problem with, is if evil is real, that means God created it. Okay? Now there's some logical steps in there. If evil is real and God created everything, then that means that God created evil. Now you might say, well, God didn't create evil. He created the capacity for evil to be there, right? We're the ones who did evil. So that means that we created something, right? You can create, okay? So if evil is real, then God had to create it. If evil is not real, and by real might be the wrong sense. If evil is concrete, if evil is a force, let's say a force, for lack of a better term. If evil is a force, God had to create it. If evil is the lack of something, if it's the absence of something, God didn't have to create it. Because what would that mean? That doesn't make any sense for God to have created. There's nothing for God to create. If evil is the lack of something, then God didn't create it. So one of the things that this solves, even though there's other problems, is it solves the kind of the difficulty we have in reconciling what evil is, if it is something, if it is real, if it's tangible, if this pen is evil, right? If this contained all the evil, right? Let's just pretend all the evil in the world is in this pen. And I went, well, who created that pen? And You go, oh, well, we did it. I'm like, whoa, we created something? We created the evil? You go, well, no, that doesn't seem right. God had to have created it. We'll keep going on. Just know that, oh, go ahead.
Isn't evil just sin?
Okay, but is sin a real thing?
Or is it just the lack
It's
of
the
good?
lack of.
You could be like, well, okay, well, sin is an action. Okay, so sin is, you might say, well, sin's not a substance, it's an action, right? But then we still have to answer the question, well, what is that action? Is sin just not obeying God? Or is sin actually doing something, following something? Is it a real thing?
But God created good,
God created everything good.
everything good.
Yep.
So in doing that, he also, I don't want to say without his knowledge, but unintentionally created the conditions for evil.
Well, so unintentionally would be rough there.
Well, I'm just saying, by creating good, he knew by creating good,
Yeah.
evil is going to exist
Well,
because of the lack of that.
Well,
It's the free will part of it.
okay, well, that's just say. So if you have two conditions there, right? Because I think you're on the right track. For if God creates good, and then if God creates man good, let's escape man. If God creates man good, but then God also gives man free will. Inherently wrapped up in free will is the possibility that man is going to use his free will to disobey God.
Free will is a vacuum that can
Right.
be filled by good or by
It's
evil.
very yin and yang.
So that's what Manichaeism is, right? That's yin and yang. It's like this kind of balancing. Augustine's denying that. He's saying evil is the lack of good. So let's look at Confessions, and we'll talk more about this. He's writing this earlier, and he's writing about in her earlier life. He says, "I came to understand that everything that exists is good, even if it can be corrupted." Okay, Tom said this. Everything's good. God created everything good. Things can only be corrupted if they're good to begin with.
So there
Right,
goes that
Lucifer's-
original sin.
Lucifer's corrupted, right?
Yeah.
Said Luther, is a Freudian slip. Otherwise, there would be nothing to corrupt. If something were perfectly good, it wouldn't be corruptible, right? And this is kind of if there's something that has the capacity to be corruptible versus something that can't be corrupted, we would say it's better to not be able to be corrupted. So since things can be corrupted, if they're not perfectly good, that's kind of probably how I was going through this. But if something has no goodness at all, then it couldn't be corrupted in the first place. There'd be nothing to corrupt if it was all evil. Corruption harms a thing. This is where he really gets into it. Corruption, he's talking about what is corruption? Corruption harms a thing by reducing its goodness. Okay? So he'll say if something is 100% good, and I know, whatever, that's not perfect good, but let's just use it. If something's 100% good, it's corrupted by making it 90% good, 80% good, 70% good.
So it would be like diluting
Yeah.
a pure, like, spice or whatever.
Yeah,
Diluting it.
or he would be, but he wouldn't say diluting because you're adding something to it. So he would say it's like you're just removing it. You're taking something. Now you're taking something away. So he says, so corruption wouldn't harm something unless it took away some of its goodness. If something were entirely deprived of goodness, it would cease to exist. This is a big point of Augustine. It would cease to exist because it is the goodness in things that allows them to exist. Right? God created everything good, right? One of the things that God gave everything when it was good was what? Life, breath. The fact that we live is good. It's a testament to something that God did. So life is one of the attributes of goodness that God gave to his creation. It's one of the things he looked at and said it was good. He didn't look at it and it was all dead. It was all alive. Life is, and we know this because what does sin do? Sin kills. Sin destroys, right? So he says life is one of the things that is good, that makes something good. Therefore, as long as something exists, as long as it's real, as long as it exists, it must still be good in some way, even if the only good in it is that it's alive. Okay? Because there's still the essence, there's something that God created. That's something that God gave it, right? Because if you said, no, it's entirely bad, then you'd go, well, what keeps that thing alive? What gives that? Where does our breath come from? What does the Bible say? Where does our breath come from? Every breath's from God.
God, yeah.
There's one thing I like Some people say that all that it would take for all this to cease to exist is for God to stop thinking about it. God won't have to do anything other than flick the light switch off, basically. It'll all be gone. Where hell, he sustains everything. Talks about Jesus. It's not only that he created it, he's sustaining it. He gives us our daily breath. Everything that exists then is good in some way. I realized that the evil I had been searching for, he's talking about in his youth when he was a Manichaean, he was looking for the force of evil. I realized that the evil I had been searching for doesn't exist as a substance. This is big, remember? Love exists as a substance for Augustine. Who is love for Augustine?
The Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is a substance because God is substance. And if God is love, and love is, and God is a substance, love is a substance. So love is a substance, but he's saying evil doesn't exist as a substance. If it were a substance, it would have to be good. Because substances are either incorruptible, and therefore perfectly good, or corruptible, and thus still good enough to be corrupted. Right? So what he's saying is, and again, he's logically built this. And you don't have to agree with him, but you can appreciate in 400 AD just his rhetorical skill and the logical flow of his argument. It's really well done. He's saying if God giving something life is part of the goodness of that thing. So one of the things that makes Jordan good and this pen not, this is just something we made, is because Jordan's alive. And and you can be like, well, who made Jordan alive? And you can be, well, it's Joe Beth. And I'm not taking anything away from Joe Beth. But Joe Beth is not the original cause, right? Because Joe Beth is alive. Like, if you go far back enough, everything that is alive today is alive because God gave it breath. And the Bible actually says not only is it alive because God gave it breath, it's alive because God continues to sustain it. So what Augustine's saying is if being alive is one of the good things that God gave people, then something that's alive is still good, at least has some good, even if it's just the good of being alive. Right? If sin could fully corrupt, what does sin produce in James? When it's fully developed, what does sin bring about? Death. Fully corrupt. You can't be alive. So he's saying, okay, if evil's a substance, and for him, just like the Holy Spirit is love, a substance is like alive, if you want to think of it that way. If evil is a substance and substance is alive, then it can't be fully evil because it's alive. And to be alive means you have some good, right? That's what he says right here. If it were a substance, evil, it would have to be good, at least somewhat good, because substances are either incorruptible, therefore perfectly good, which obviously evil isn't, or corruptible, and thus still good enough to be corrupted. If something can be corrupted, that means there's something good in it to corrupt. He says, I understand that you, God, made all things good. Nothing exists that wasn't made by you. And everything you made is good, though not all things are equally good. All things together are very good because you made them that way. God makes everything good. Sin is a corrupting influence. But sin doesn't fully corrupt. We're still made in God's image. Even though sin came and we fell, we're still made in God's image. There's still goodness in us. Not moral goodness. I'm not talking about goodness in a moral sense. I'm talking about goodness in a like a spark of the divine sense, and something that's left in us by God. And so for Augustine, he'll say, so evil can't be alive like we are, or God created it, right? Because all life ultimately comes from God. Or God created it, and there would have to be some kind of good in it to corrupt, which it would be weird to think of evil as something that still had a way to get eviler. What does that mean? If you're talking about evil as a substance, as the yin-yang thing, and it's alive, then that means there's something to corrupt. So this is Augustine dealing with the problem of evil.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, with this belief right here,
Yeah.
back then you were saying that a lot of people wait to get baptized until right before their deathbed to
They did,
be
yeah.
cleansed.
Yeah.
So, if somebody just suddenly died, they would, from what he's saying right here, it would be because evil, because they had no more goodness in them. Like they were fully corrupt, and that's
we die now because of, but when we die now, as Christians, you go to heaven.
right.
So
But I'm
there's
talking
fully
about
goodness.
back then.
Yeah, even then, they would think that.
But,
Yeah, so we're talking more, when he's talking about life and death and things, he's talking more in generalities. So he's not saying that like, oh, this person that gets to 75 or 80 or whatever and they die, that's because they used up all the good, right? And evil won. It would be more of the, like, yes, people die because we live in this sinful, broken, fallen world. People won't die in heaven. But yeah, it's not like it's not that kind of transactional.
Well,
it's not that like
spiritual
mathematical.
death.
I would just,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was just thinking like if like somebody my age died, like you see what I'm saying?
Well,
like,
if someone your age died, there could be a.
somebody could come back and be like, well,
Well, I mean, especially to look at Jesus' day. When somebody, the man who was born blind. So like, who sinned?
yeah,
Did he sin in the womb? Did his parents
the
sin?
originals, yeah.
What some kind of evil caused this man's
Yeah.
deformity?
So
they
this is
didn't
how
know that.
rumors were started back then.
Oh yeah, yeah. This is how witches
They died
were.
early, and then they're like,
You use Jordan as an example
Yeah.
as being good.
Sure.
Let's say that
It's a good
Jordan
example.
is 100%, his vessel is 100% filled with good.
Which Augustine would say no human is now after the fall, but sure.
Right, but I'm just for
Yeah,
the
yeah,
sake
yeah,
of the
yeah,
argument
yeah,
here.
yeah.
If we could remove 30% of his good in a graduated vessel, you take away 30%. In this vessel, there's this much good now. Does evil come in to fill that 30%?
Great question. So what Augustine would say,
Because it's a lack of
in
good,
reality,
so it's
maybe.
evil.
What Augustine would say is you can talk about evil filling that, but all it really is a void.
Okay,
So
so
there's nothing.
it's a void. So he's still 100%.
No, he's-
lesser of 100%.
Yeah, so
lesser
he's
volume of 100%.
Yeah, he's 70%, right?
They're going
Well,
to bed.
the vessel is.
Your
but
body walking around.
he's not contaminated. He's a smaller volume of
Well,
100%.
what I gotta say is the corruption is the removal of the 30%, because then you're not
Okay,
fully
okay,
man.
okay,
You're not
okay.
fully good. And what he would say is now in heaven, you're all back to 100%.
Okay.
Augustine, since we're born in original sin, none of us are born 100 anymore.
Right.
We're all born,
so
whatever.
would that just be
Okay.
the same argument of like the glass is half full, no, it's half empty?
Well,
It's like it's you're half good, but also, no, you're half bad. Like,
yeah. Well, and if you saw bad as an equal force, you can make that argument. For Augustine, it's nonsensical. Just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
If you said the glass is half empty, you're like, yeah, because some corruption removed 50% of the water.
Yeah, Jordan drank
Yeah.
it.
So here's some of the key elements of his view of evil. Goodness as a foundation of existence. Everything that this is on yours, this is mine. Everything that exists is good to some degree because it was created by God. Even corruptible things are good in their existence, though they may become deficient. Evil is deficiency. Evil does not exist in itself, rather it is a lack of goodness, just as darkness is the absence of light. We talked all about that. Human free will plays a significant role in the existence of evil. Augustine argues that evil results from the misuse of free will, which I think most of us would agree with, even if you don't agree with his view of evil. Creatures, by their own will, turn away from God, the highest good, and this turning away is what causes moral evil. I think we would all probably agree with that as well. Evil corrupts good things by diminishing their goodness. However, if something were entirely deprived of all goodness, it would cease to exist. So here's some opposing theological views. We talked about Manichaeanism, this dualism, that in that system they argue that good and evil are both real, substantial forces. They're locked in an eternal struggle. The Manichaeans believe that evil is a substance with its own independent existence, often associated with materiality and darkness. Remember, they're one of those that's like material bad, spiritual good. The material is evil, and it's a substance. They believe that evil is a real cosmic power. Humanity is trapped between these two forces and must strive to align with the good. So, for instance, you say like the devil, Lucifer. So obviously Augustine believes in the devil, but Augustine would say like, well, yeah, the devil's corrupted, but the devil wasn't like evil from the beginning, right? Lucifer was an angel of light. So it's not, if you said, well, the devil, that's evil personified, right? Kind of as our culture sees it, the devil's evil personified. For Augustine to say, that makes my point. Like, if the devil is evil personified, the devil was corrupted. The devil was an angel of light that then was corrupted, and now what's left is this. But he's not evil itself. For instance, the devil can't be everywhere at once, right? The devil's not omniscient. The devil's not omnipresent, right? You'll see that there's like this famous like meme or photo where it's like Jesus and he's arm wrestling with the devil. It's ridiculous. The devil has no power. The devil can't arm wrestle Jesus. They're not equal forces. There's no actual struggle here, right? It's not Jesus. What would that even mean? Would Jesus struggle arm wrestling the devil? No, the devil's just a corrupted angel, a weaker, lesser being. Doesn't even compare with God. God's divinity. God's uncreated. God's omniscient, all powerful, all knowing. The devil is limited. He's limited in. Jimmy talked about how God's outside of space and time. The devil's not outside of space and time. The devil's in space and time. So if you saw the devil as evil personified, and you saw evil as a force, you would have to at least admit that evil is far weaker than good. Evil's far weaker if you see good as God. So there's Manichaeism, there's Pelagianism that believed absolute freedom of human will. We've talked about Pelagius, that he believed that humans could choose between good and evil on their own. And Augustine, obviously, he taught that we're all a little corrupted by original sin. We all start with a few strikes against us. We'll do Calvinism, or determinism, since Jimmy mentioned it. And we're going to, a little bit, get into predestination. So Calvinism, particularly in its emphasis on divine sovereignty and predestination, holds that God has predetermined all events. That's determinism, right? God's predetermined everything, including the existence of evil. If God predetermines everything, then he would have to predetermine the existence of evil. It's not a he knows, right? Some Calvinists, the ones that actually believe what they teach. Some Calvinists argue that God ordains even the occurrence of moral evil, this murder, this rape, this adultery, this whatever, this war. It's God ordained. God ordains even the occurrence of moral evil for a higher, incomprehensible good. Okay? If you like that, you're welcome to the Reformed faith.
I'm still Catholic.
Yeah. Yeah, Catholics actually have an interesting idea of we'll talk about Catholics and predestination. So while Augustine also emphasizes God's sovereignty clearly and grace, Calvinism's view that God may have ordained evil actions for divine purposes differs from Augustine's emphasis on free will, which is so funny because he's not an Arminian. Obviously Jacob Arminius comes way after, but Augustine is, would never be seen as that. Obviously he's not Reformed either. All these arguments, Reformed, Calvinism, Arminianism, that's way after Augustine. That's 1,000 years after. As well as a source of moral evil. Calvinism can lead to a more deterministic understanding of evil, obviously, where human freedom plays a lesser role. So in Calvinism, evil may be part of God's plan, though its purpose is ultimately mysterious. Augustine, by contrast, argues that while God permits evil, right, God has the power to stop it, it arises from the free choices of creatures and is not positively willed by God. So Augustine will say something like what we've said, that evil exists, evil occurs, evil actions happen because humans with free will choose to sin, choose to not obey God. And although God permits that, and although God knows that that's the case, and although God could stop every instance of evil, moral evil, if he wanted to, and that sometimes is really hard to swallow on some instances, it's not made by God. It's not created by God. It's not positively willed by God. God doesn't go in his sovereignty and determine and go like, I will this murder to happen because there's some mysterious, incomprehensible plan. Whereas Calvinism will go, no, God ordains even the occurrence of moral evil for some good that we don't know. So Calvinism and as far as the problem of evil, Calvinism and Augustine did not agree. Now you have another option, okay? Besides joining Catholicism with Mother Stephanie over here, you have process theology, which we talked about a little bit. Process theology asserts that God is not omnipotent in the classical sense, okay? And this is the argument that God is inside of time. And It's also known as there's something that goes with process theology a lot called open theism, but we won't get into that right now. God is not omnipotent in the classical sense, and the world is constantly changing and evolving. In this view, God is involved in the process of the world's development, but even God cannot prevent the existence of evil because evil is part of the evolutionary process of growth and change. It's a byproduct of this development, of this process. Process theology challenges the classical understanding of God's immutability, he can't change, and omnipotence, he's all-powerful. It views evil not as a privation of good, but as an inevitable part of the world's dynamic and creative process. It's the whole, you can't get an omelet without breaking a few eggs thing. Instead of seeing evil as a deficiency, it often views evil as part of the creative tension that propels progress. If this sounds... I can't think of it. If this sounds modern, it's because it is, obviously. Process theology rejects the idea that evil is simply a lack of good. Instead, it suggests that evil is a byproduct of the world's ongoing process of development. If that sounds enlightenment, if that sounds Marxist to you, it is. Where both good and bad experiences contribute to growth. This stands in stark contrast to Augustine's view. So, process theology is around. I mean, it is it's there. You can believe a lot of different things. You can come to the end of it, and you can say, I'm a determinist. I'm a reformed. I'm not saying I am, but you could say I'm a determinist. I'm reformed. I'm a 5-pointer Calvinist. And like Jimmy said on Sunday, you could be a part of this church. You're not going to like this. You wouldn't like the sermon last Sunday, but I mean, how often does Jimmy talk about that? Really? I mean, yeah. You could be all with Augustine, and you could be like, evil is the privation of good. It's the lack of everything. I think his argument makes a lot of sense. That's fine. You could come to this church. If you're if you believe in process theology, if you see that, then I don't think we can. We so fundamentally differ on what evil could be and is that I don't know how we go from here. We're so far. You're gonna have a hard time going to church here and being a process theologian. Okay. I mean, for one thing, you don't believe God's omnipotent. Now, I mean, are there going to be people that believe in process theology that are in heaven? Sure. Because not believing in process theology is not a requirement for salvation. What do you have to do to be saved? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. You can have awful theology, still believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved. I'm sure I'll get to heaven and I'll be wrong on a bunch of stuff. Maybe Calvin will just be there shaking his head.
Sounds like process theology gives man more credit for that rather than just giving all the credit to God.
Yeah, it gives man credit. It also kind of excuses evil. It's like evil's a byproduct. It's going to happen. There's nothing we can do to stop it. Just go with the flow, man. This world's evolving. This world's changing. We're changing with it. And as part of that, sometimes evil pops up, and God can't do anything. It pops up, and God might do something about it, but it's whack-a-mole. I mean, God can't stop every evil. God's on this journey with us. He's experiencing himself.
Come get in my van.
Yeah. It's very very 60s hippie trippy. It's actually very Marxist. It's very the idea of of even God in a way going through change and process. This is where you can go, well, the God of the Old Testament was an angry, grumpy old man, but the God of the New Testament was a God of love and grace. And you say, well, this sounds dumb, and you would be right, but it happens all the time. Well, there was a very famous, Andy Stanley? Is that Charles Stanley's son? Andy Stanley? Mm-hmm. Andy Stanley, a few years ago, famously said, we need to unhitch our wagon from the Old Testament. We need to unhitch our wagon. We need to leave that God aside. And they might not come out and say this, but I listen to it and I go, process theology. You have, God's evolving, right? No, God's not evolving.
So Augustine would say that God creates everything good.
Yes.
But he also didn't step in and allow, or he allowed man to make choices. He allowed free will.
Yep.
knowing that the byproduct of free will would be the corruption of good.
I mean, anytime you have free will, there's a chance that someone's going to choose not.
Because we're
right.
because we're fallible.
Yeah.
So we kind of are, even from the beginning, it's like,
We have the capacity to be corrupted.
right. And if somebody has the capacity to be corrupted, pretty much, it's hard to keep something pure.
I mean, it's not hard. God could have just removed free will.
He could have, but he didn't.
Yeah.
I guess that's what Augustine would say, that God didn't create evil, but in a sense he sort of allowed.
He didn't create evil because
for-
evil's not. It's not a
It's not
thing.
a thing. But,
Yeah,
he-
so there's nothing to create if it's not real.
but the corruption is real.
Yeah, corruption is just you're not 100% anymore. You're 70%.
Right.
You're now 30% less of. You're 30% less than you were before. You're 30% less good. You know, Tom doesn't like it.
It's quantum religion.
Yeah. So you either way you're gonna have you have issues. You have to pick your poison. Either you have to say God created evil in some sense, okay, or you have to say if evil's a real thing, if evil's a substance, the way they would say love is, because love is God is love. If evil is a real thing, either God created it, or you think something else can create. Correct?
Yep.
Can we agree on that? Either God created it,
Or something did.
or something created it. And creation is not the same thing as corruption. I mean, the famous example is Tolkien, the orcs. You know, Sauron and Morgoth. I'll get real nerdy here. The orcs aren't a creation. They didn't create them. Only Eru Ilúvatar can create. The orcs are corrupted elves, right? They corrupted them. So if you want to think about it, so you go, you know, if we're going to get out of this world and you're going to go to Middle Earth, you have to go, okay, either Sauron can create, right?
Yeah.
Or the orcs are a corruption. And the corruption is of something that's created. And if there's something that's corrupted, then they're not fully evil, because for Augustine he would say they're not fully evil because they're alive, and part of being life is a good gift from God. And if you are alive, then there's still something that sin can corrupt, which is your life, and then you would be dead. They wouldn't exist, right? If Sauron could completely remove all trace of, you know, Ilúvatar's will for the orcs, then they would cease to exist. So bringing it back into the real world. For those of you who follow that, kudos to you. That was very homeschooled. So for Augustine, he would say that. So you know, you have to pick, right? You can say evil's a real thing, but then you have to wrestle with and there's good answers to it. I'm not saying, but then you have to wrestle with okay, then who created it? If it's a real thing, how did it get created, right? Or with Augustine, he would say it's not. It's just a corruption. It's just a good elf made into an evil orc. If it's not a real thing, then it feels real, right? And what Augustine is not saying is he's not saying that evil doesn't exist in the sense of like sin isn't real or bad things don't happen. He's not saying that evil isn't. You can't look at something and say this is evil. You know, this person murdering this person is evil. What Augustine would go is like, yeah, it's evil because we call it evil because the person didn't make the good choice, which is not to kill the person. They made the evil choice, which is to kill the person.
No, they didn't make the evil choice.
That's true. They failed to make.
Chose to not do the.
Yeah,
good
they
choice.
failed to make the good choice.
Yeah.
Which even then, it's even sin is not only an action; it can be an inaction. In fact, it really is an
I
inaction.
think I got it.
It's the inability to choose the right.
Yeah.
Either way, there's like either one. There's a little bit something. All right, are we good on evil? Did we solve the problem?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Solved.
As long, I don't care what you are, as long as you're not a process theologian. As long as you don't think God's evolving with us, then we can talk. All right, take a few, pass it down. Take one, pass it down.
So you would really.
Oh, sorry. There's 3 pages to this, or 2 pages to this one. So make sure when you grab it, you get both pages.
So you would really kick me out of this class then, huh?
What if you were a process theologian? Yeah, it'd be rough. Yeah. I mean, I'll see you in heaven, I guess. So you have one page that says Augustine on predestination. It's 2 double-sided. Your second page should be a bullet point that starts with the purpose of God's predestination.
And the 6th one.
Oh, here we go. Just keep passing those down. So you should have 2 pages. So we'll briefly look at Augustine on predestination. We won't read it all. Some might have my notes. They may be on the bottom of that stack. So I don't know. We'll see what Mom comes up with. I might need those back. Is it all just that, or is there something different? I might not have had my notes on it, which is fine.
We should have 3 sheets.
You should have 2. One that starts with Augustine on predestination, one that's the purpose of.
Okay, but
Yeah.
3 including the one you gave us.
Yes, 3 including the one if you got the early one.
Yeah.
Hey, would you mind handing that back to me? Thanks, sir. Okay. So for this next reading, I know it's a little bit more, but okay, that's fine. Actually, I did. Yes, I did. Look at me go. All right. So you have a chapter. Actually, both of these come from his work on the predestination of the saints.
Is that a book you wrote, or
It's one of the 3 million books he wrote.
chapter 36?
Wow.
Whoa.
So,
Well, as you can see,
It's short chapter.
yeah, the short chapters are more like little
Yeah.
sections.
Yeah.
so where was this book in the?
This is later on.
Okay.
This is later Augustine. I don't know exactly where. It's going to probably be after. I don't know. He spent 20 years working on his book on the Trinity. It's after Confessions for sure. It's later. It's more developed Augustine. It's after he has to deal with Pelagius. So it's part of that rather. So again, I translated a translation, so it should be a little easier to read. I know it's a little bit more, but really it's just kind of a page, less than a page and a half, really. And then there's a longer summary. So the summary is kind of is really kind of detailed, a little bit more detailed. So briefly, I will give you an intro onto Augustine's view of predestination, and in the 10 minutes that we have, a few other kind of options.
Well, are you going to tell us what you think about evil?
So Augustine's a lot smarter than I am, so I'm not going to disagree with him. I mean, so are the people that I tend to agree with Augustine. Part of the reason I do is because it's very clear that that's the view in the Old Testament. Actually, the devil is an individual, other than Lucifer, is not even there. Like the Satan in Job, it's just Satan in the Old Testament is just a term. It just means accuser. It was a role of an angel. Like the idea that it was the devil in heaven, like arguing with God. No, it was an angel that God had given the role to scour the earth and find someone who was whatever. The tying of the snake to Satan, the tying of Lucifer as the devil, all of those kinds of things. That's something that you don't even get until you get into the New Testament. So part of it is that. Part of it is I just think if I have to choose, I sleep better at night saying when evil's all around us, going, God didn't create it. God didn't create it, and it's our fault because we choose to not obey God. We don't choose the right thing, and whenever you don't choose the right thing, this is what happens. So I like Augustine's view.
Could have said that 20 minutes ago.
We got to wrestle through it. These ideas have been wrestled with by Christians
Welcome
for
to
70
theology
years.
class.
Well, and it's a great point because part of this, this journey that we just went on, not to sound like process theologian, but this journey that we just went on, that is, you guys are learning how to. And I'm not I'm not trying to sound condescending, but we're doing theology. What we just did is like training our brains how to think theologically.
Well, when you get questions from people who are not believers or are believers but struggle with this idea that, because this, what we talked about, does translate really in real life, because people are like, well, you know, this happened because, God made the devil, and so the devil
Yeah.
goes, well, wait a minute.
Yeah, God can't help it. God can't stop the devil.
Yeah, it can't
So,
stop you.
I mean, think of it this way.
He will one day.
If before this class, if someone come to you and they said, "So is God? Did God create evil, or is evil not real?"
Most people say
You would go. Wait. Now you can have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
And you might call me and be like, "Hey, which one do we believe?"
Hey, Josh.
But you've learned how to wrestle through these things. We wrestled through this theologically. All right, his view of predestination, his doctrine of predestination. Now, I will say this again. This wasn't his central thing. This became a really big deal because of Calvin and Arminius later on. They went to it. But he did have a doctrine of predestination. It's central to his theological thought, particularly in his opposition to Pelagian idea of free will. So remember, Pelagius looks around Rome. He's a British monk. He looks around Rome and he says, it's cheap grace. All these people just go on sinning and go like, it doesn't matter because I'm forgiven. God's going to forgive me. So I can just kind of live however I want. Oh, I sinned again. Oh, I'm sorry, God. He's going to forgive me. And Pelagius goes, this is ridiculous. This is, no. Like, you can not sin. Okay? So Pelagius is a heretic, but it comes from a good place. He looks at people and he goes, they're blaming this sin nature. I just can't help it. I'm just a sinner. And thank the Lord. Every time I sin, His grace abounds and I'm good. They're using it as a license to sin. Pelagius is like, this is ridiculous. So Pelagius will say, no, you have free will. You don't have to sin. You're born with the capacity to choose to sin or not. Okay, so we've talked about Pelagius. So Augustine argued that God's grace is sovereign and free. He said that predestination is God's eternal choice to save some individuals and to allow others to remain in their sin. This choice is not based on any foreseen merit or action, but solely on God's grace and will. Augustine believed that God chose certain individuals before the foundation of the world to be saved. This was not due to foreknowledge of who would choose holiness, which is kind of how Jimmy described it, but so that they might become holy. God's grace makes them willing and able to choose Him. For Augustine, those predestined to salvation receive an irresistible grace. So Calvin later fully developed Augustine's ideas, particularly in his doctrine of double predestination. Okay, so predestination, those who are elected, right? Calvin will say, actually, that you're not just those some are elected for heaven and the other are damned to hell, basically.
Unelected.
Well, more than that. They're actually elected to go to heaven.
Elected to not be.
So Augustine would later argue that God predestines both the elect and the reprobate, as he would say, double predestination, unconditional election. You get tulip, right? So Calvin took Augustine's ideas and formalized them into a comprehensive system of theology. His ideas were later codified in the Reformed tradition, particularly in the 5 points of Calvinism. What you have to understand about Augustine's views is that Augustine is responding to Pelagius. Okay, would Augustine like where Calvinism went? Well, clearly he wouldn't agree with him on the problem of evil. He's not a determinist in that sense. So it's debatable whether he would like where they took Calvinism, where they took this idea. Okay, so there's some arguments against predestination. Jimmy mentioned Jacob Arminius, the Dutch. He believed that he challenged Calvinist predestination, especially the idea of unconditional election and double predestination. There's the idea of Arminianism, which is God's election is based on foreknowledge. God predestines those whom He foresees will respond to His grace and faith. Election is not arbitrary, but based on God's foreknowledge. We have free will. Although we're fallen, we have the ability to respond to God's grace. God's prevenient grace that goes before, enables everyone to choose faith or reject it. Universal atonement, Christ's atonement was for all people, not just the elect. Anybody can, God just knows. So Arminianism is more on God's foreknowledge. God foresees things, and then He decides things. He predestines things based on that. Okay, so it's a way to kind of preserve free will and God's sovereignty. You don't have to be an Arminian; you can be a Calvinist. Then you have Stephanie, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Catholics adopted a version of predestination They reject the Calvinist understanding of unconditional election and double predestination, but they're non-Arminian. The Catholics taught that they emphasized the cooperation between God's grace and human free will. God's grace enables humans to respond to Him, so without God's grace, nobody can be saved. But humans must freely cooperate with that grace for salvation. Okay? While salvation is entirely by grace, Catholics hold that humans can respond to grace, and their actions, again prompted by grace, contribute to their justification. So you might have liked the first one. The second point, you probably don't like, because you're Protestant, Stephanie. The Church affirms predestination, but not in the way that excludes free will. God's grace enables the free choice to respond to His call. And in response to the Reformation, the Council of Trent affirmed that God's grace is necessary for salvation, but individuals retain the freedom to cooperate with or resist that grace. So they're Arminian in a little bit, okay? They seem somewhat Arminian, but they go to this merit thing, that humans can actually, your actions actually can contribute to your own justification. And as Protestants, we go, there's nothing we can do to contribute to our justification. Then you've got the Eastern Orthodox Church. They reject everything because they're weird. Salvation is seen as a process of becoming one with God, theosis. We just kind of like be merged into the divine. Obviously, Wesley and Methodists reject Calvinists. They're influenced by Arminianism. So Augustine laid the groundwork for the doctrine of predestination, emphasizing God's grace as the decisive factor in salvation, denying that human merit or free will plays a role in election. Calvin further developed these ideas into the very not fun, very kind of severe form of predestination, which led to them killing a dude in Geneva. But you want to be a Calvinist.
What is the time difference between Augustine and then Calvin?
It's 1,000 years.
Okay.
I mean, actually more, 1,100 years.
But quite a bit of time.
Yeah, and after Aristotle too.
Okay.
So I mean, not Aristotle. Aristotle's before Aquinas. So that's part of the difficulty when you have somebody like Calvin because Luther takes Augustine's doctrine. I mean, he's an Augustinian monk. I mean, Augustine leaves open the possibility of the Protestant Reformation for a lot of different reasons. I mean, he is the father. That's one of the reasons we studied Augustine. He was so pivotal to the Catholic Church. He's so pivotal to the Protestant Church. Eastern Orthodox, they don't care, but they're weird. They just are. I'm sorry. I have some Eastern Orthodox friends. They're all a little fruity. It is what it is. But yeah, it's tough because you don't know. Augustine's responding to Pelagius. And most of the times when you respond, you're taken, if you think of a clock, an old grandfather clock. So clocks used to be really big. There's this big pendulum.
She has
Why'd
the grandfather clock.
Okay, good. So on the grandfather clock, a pendulum will swing. And then the reaction to that, Augustine Pelagianism, right? And Augustine's like, over my dead body. And he grabs and he swings that bad boy. But you have to be careful because although you might try to swing back to the middle, it's pretty easy to start swinging it the other way. And the question is, how would Augustine's responding to Pelagius? Calvin's taking Augustine and furthering it for his own things. He's responding to the Catholic Church, right? So the question is, how would Augustine have dealt with Calvin? Would he have agreed with Calvin's conclusions or not? I have a hard time thinking so because of Augustine's emphasis on love. Okay.
Yeah, because love is pointless.
Well, it's just like Calvinism to its extreme, and I would say Calvinism faithfully done is just really rough.
Well, I mean,
there's a reason we call all the Calvinists I would call it the Calvin Nazis. They were rough people. I've never met. Now, there's plenty of Reformed people that I love. Okay, there's a whole church. There's whole churches, but who would disagree with a lot of these like extreme Calvinist views. But really, I just think that they're not following Calvin to his logical conclusion. If you follow Calvin's logic to the end, find a true Calvinist that's unapologetic that goes, no, I believe that God ordained this rape to happen for some good. Those guys are fun to debate because at least they're honest. Okay, and you go, you're a Calvinist, you're a determinist. None of these milk lottery ones we got. Right?
I don't think I'm going to be debating anybody anytime soon unless you've got like a earpiece in my ear. Be like, hold on, you tell me what to say.
So I think Augustine. I don't know what Augustine would say because he didn't deal with the Catholic Church in the 1500s. He dealt with Pelagius in the 400s. So we'll get into more. You read this. We'll talk about what he teaches. It's really tough to read Augustine and talk about predestination because I can't get us before Calvin. You know what I'm saying? It'd be great to talk about these ideas in the 500s.
Like when we had no idea what Calvin was.
Yeah, it's just so, like, we can't unlearn, we can't unlearn Calvinism. It's so entrenched. We can't unlearn these debates, and so there is no way to kind of like purely talk about this. But we'll have fun. We'll talk about predestination from Augustine's view, and then we will preview next week. And we only have, so we have predestination, and then we have one more week after that, and then we're done. And we'll be done with Augustine.
Are you going to do another class after Augustine?
I will. We're going to take a break for the holidays, and then we'll come back around and we'll do sometime in the spring. We'll start another one. My goal is to do one. I'll take breaks at different times, but yeah, and you can always skip them if you are not interested. But I will say that for all of you who will or have made it to the end because you're almost there, I'm really proud of you guys for wrestling with these and learning how to think theologically. And it's less about like having something really well down and just more of the idea of like thinking about it. Okay, and I don't know about you. Have any of you ever kind of thought about this kind of stuff before?
I mean,
Yeah, totally.
to a certain extent, yes, but not.
Couldn't make it make any sense.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that just this stretching of the muscle and of your brain, of your theological muscle, the church needs that. Yeah. There are way too many people that go into a service and they sit there and they see Andy Stanley, who, God bless him, Andy Stanley's done a lot of good things. Okay, he's not his daddy, but Charles Stanley was really something. But Andy Stanley's got some good messages. Who sit there and they hear Andy Stanley go, "We should hitch our wagon from the Old Testament," and they go like, "Oh, well, I guess we should," because Andy Stanley said it. He's our pastor. He's this big guy. And not enough people who think theologically that go, "Wait a minute." I mean, you want to be the Bereans. Okay, remember in Acts, Paul teaches from the Scriptures, St. Paul, and they go, "Yeah, I don't know. We haven't heard it that way before. Let's go back to the Scriptures. Let's think about this ourselves. Let's work through this." Be the person that works through it, that asks questions, that really, because at the end of the day, Tom is standing before God and has to answer for how you lived, and how you live comes from what you believe. And at that point, you don't get to be like, "What did Andy Stanley? Where's Andy?" Who will? Now, I'm not saying that because Andy's not in heaven.
Where's Josh?
Yeah. Or where's Josh? Right? Because it's going to be you. So you wrestle with it. And what Jimmy said on Sunday, I agree with. I'm not a determinist. I'll be very honest. Other people are.
Get our checklist.
Yeah. So you could wrestle with what Jimmy said. And wrestle with what I teach. I mean, and again, I'm teaching Augustine. I'm not saying we've all read Augustine throughout these weeks and said, I don't really agree with that. I agree with this, whatever. But even that's great. Sometimes you agree with Augustine. Sometimes you don't. Work through it. Wrestle with it. Don't just. We're not reading Augustine and being like, Augustine was this great, brilliant theologian, which he was, who's influenced all of us, which he did. So we just believe whatever he says.
Yeah.
That's not what we do. Don't do that. All right. Sorry, I kept too long. But yeah, we're almost done. I'm very proud of you guys.